Hello there, and welcome to the Thinking Fellows podcast. My name is Caleb, and today I am joined by my father, Dr. Sky Keith, and by Adam Francisco, and we will be talking about reading The Hobbit today. The Thinking Fellows is part of the 1517 podcast network of shows. You can go to 1517.org/podcasts to see all of our shows there. And 1517 is more than a podcast network. You can go to 1517.org's homepage to see changing content every day. We have new blogs, basically, 5-6 days a week. We have preaching helps. We have conferences. And speaking of conferences, the conference video from this year's Here We Still Stand in San Diego is out now on our YouTube channel. If you would like to watch those, you can go to 1517 at YouTube. I'll put a link in the show notes. You can watch all of the plenary sessions and the breakouts, including mine there. If you want to watch my breakout, pump the views a little bit, you can do that on our YouTube channel. And the best way to find out what's happening over there, keep up with conference video, keep up with new stuff, is to subscribe both to this show, The Thinking Fellows, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Overcast, Podcast Addict. But you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, and then you don't have to wait for my silly little announcements. You can just do it. So you can see those by subscribing to 1517 on YouTube. Again, there's a link in the show notes. Or if you type 1517 into your search bar on YouTube, it comes up pretty quickly. Okay, guys, talking about The Hobbit. Now, before we do that, I should just extend my announcements. Last week when I was editing this show, I could immediately tell that I sounded exhausted, which is, I wasn't fooling anybody that I regularly wake up in time for this.
Well, I'm sitting here thinking
podcast.
It's 6:40 in Big Bear, and Adam's the one that's yawning, and it's almost 10 o'clock in Chicago.
So,
no, it's almost 9.
Oh, I thought you were 3 hours.
It's 2 hours, dude.
2 hours Chicago. I lived there. You'd think I'd know that.
Yeah. So
I've been up. I got to get kids dressed, to school, fed.
I was
peed.
Editing this episode just initially with my laptop speakers at my kitchen counter, and my wife walks in and goes, "Woof, you were tired." And I'm like, "Dang." And then I published the episode, and I had a friend text me that was like, "Wow, buddy, your voice sounds horrible." I'm like,
"That's funny."
That's so. I woke up an hour earlier this time, and I talked a bunch. Wow. So hopefully,
I woke up an hour early, but I did not talk, because since no one is at my house, I just sat and watched YouTube.
In fact, the talking I did was I read the last couple of chapters of The Hobbit out loud to my son, who was also up early this morning. So, and he really likes getting read to, so that was nice. He had fun with that. And then I think we've talked about this before, but my dad and I only live half mile apart, and we're in the same small little mountain neighborhood. And it snowed yesterday, and I walked down here this morning from my house, and even though this is a Tolkien episode, it was very Narnia. I got to say, like, as I was walking up my street, if you walk up my street, you are facing a mountain covered in pine trees, covered in snow, with fog rolling over it. Just the breaking of dawn coming through. It was very, very cool. And then I'm walking the final couple blocks, and there's one on the whole walk, lamppost.
Yeah, there is. It's on Imperial.
Yeah, on Imperial. There's one lamppost in the middle of this snow falling out of the trees, and I was like...
Your wife and I have talked about that. She's like, "Why is there the one lamppost?"
Somebody got hit there.
I said, "I suppose somebody got hit there."
Yeah, somebody got hit there.
And
for
their
sure.
response was to put up a light.
Yeah,
because otherwise, if you walk through our neighborhood, there's no lights. There's no lights. So it's not like a real neighborhood where there's like sidewalks and
sidewalks.
Street lights and everything. There's no sidewalks. There's no street lights. It's just dark in the streets.
So I got in a very Narnia mood this morning to talk about The Hobbit.
I live on a street that doesn't have any street lights or sidewalks, and this is way off topic, but it's kind of a fun story. There's no there are no sidewalks, but other neighborhoods have sidewalks. And I'm told that for, I guess, since the 1960s, people in this neighborhood have been resisting the state or the county, I guess, and its intrusion into their property and putting sidewalks. So they build, or they'll plant trees, like right where a sidewalk would go, so that they have to, get extra. The state would have to get extra permission to build a sidewalk and so on. So for 60 years, I guess, they've been fighting, sticking it to the county.
I don't know if it's
I don't know what that has to do with The Hobbit or anything you're talking about, but it
doesn't. What do we call this? It's an unincorporated.
We're an unincorporated area.
So our unincorporated area just put in a sidewalk from the park to nowhere.
Nowhere. Literally to nowhere.
They spent 5 months doing this beautiful sidewalk that it goes nowhere. Like it stops before the next major street. Mm-hmm. It stops at this little 5-unit housing cul-de-sac thing. It stops right there,
but not into the entrance.
Yeah, I run it.
Oh, okay.
It goes into the entrance. Yeah,
that's weird. Are they planning something?
But there's the street that is just down from us. That's kind of like the main connector street for both my neighborhood street and Caleb's. There's been just a lot of death on.
Yeah. No, there has been.
Because we get Flatlanders that come up, and rent a house up here, and they'll go for a walk, and there's a little bar at the end of the street, and they'll go for a walk, but they're going for a walk like at 10 o'clock at night.
It's pitch black.
And people, especially locals, haul butt on the street.
Yeah, they drive too fast, for sure.
So that could have really used a sidewalk.
It really could have used a sidewalk.
And it did not get one.
No.
But the other street got this long sidewalk to nowhere.
Yeah.
Which I run on, so I'm the only person I've ever seen on it.
Well, walking in sidewalks to nowhere can maybe tie into Tolkien literature a little bit.
Yeah, there's a lot of walking in
because
Tolkien literature.
It is never short of walking in this. And The Hobbit, well, a little less walking than what our next fictional book would be, which is Fellowship of the Ring, where there's a lot of walking. But no, The Hobbit definitely has some walking. Tolkien, I think, liked his walking vacations. They were into that in the UK. Right?
Yeah, they still are.
Still are.
They walk along the countryside, a couple-mile walk on Sunday. Walk across they'll stumble across these, it's not just Stonehenge that's there. There's tons of these little old, I don't know if they're Druid or
hinges.
what they are, but
there's wood hinges and stone hinges. Yeah.
Yeah, there's walking paths everywhere.
That's how in Lewis's Ransom trilogy or the Space trilogy, that's how Ransom gets into trouble.
Is it walking holiday?
Yeah, he's on a walking holiday and he gets stuck in a storm and goes out to this estate to try to find shelter, and the estate is, of course, where he runs into the bad people that take him to space.
So the walking adventure. I've been
what's hard? What's hard in reading this is having watched the movies, though it's been a while. I know the Hobbit, the 3 Hobbit movies are very well. There's quite a bit added than what's in the actual book, but reading this and trying not to or keep the images from the movie out of your head as you're thinking about what a goblin looks like.
That's why Rod won't watch the movies.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I find it easier with these ones than the others, but that's probably because I don't have as fond nostalgia for the Hobbit movies. I mean, we went and saw them progressively as they came out, like the night of, and a couple things ruined those. Number one, like the advancement and just regularness of CGI versus practical effects. Now, The Lord of the Rings definitely has some CG elements, and CG isn't always bad, but you can see this, like if you watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy and then you watch the Hobbit trilogy, you go from something that is loads and loads of practical effects to predominantly CG, with the practical effects being sort of the making of men into dwarves. But outside of that, the practical effects disappear, and that's sort of tangible, and it allows them to do like weirder and weirder stuff with goblins and orcs, etc. Where actually we with the new Rings of Power, they returned a bit to some more practical effects when it comes to characters and such. Like orcs were all practical effects.
I did not appreciate the CG in the one that was on Netflix. Was it on Netflix?
Amazon. So, but yeah, I've been thinking about how to do this for a couple days. Where to start, because The Hobbit is something that you can't really spoil. It's an older book than I even remembered. So you can't spoil it. It's part of just sort of pop culture in general. And I think I would just start with that context, which is it's much. Does anybody have the exact date?
1937.
Yeah, the 30s. That's pretty old, and it doesn't feel old when I think.
Written roughly between 1929 and 1936.
Yeah, wow. It doesn't feel that old when I think about The Hobbit, which tells you something about how much of an impact The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit have had on the culture, because the content feels renewed all of the time, whether it's movies or just sort of influence. You guys feel the same way?
I suppose your dad and I were texting each other as we were reading through this or listening. Scott, you listened to it, right, on audiobook? At 1.5 speed or something like that? He was a little grumpy.
Doing other things.
A little grumpy about... And I kind of had the same or similar experience, and I think I read it when I was a teenager in high school. I think we talked last episode, Caleb, you and I, about I had that punk rock music playing in the background, but I had to turn it off to pay attention. And I really got into it when I was a teenager, but now it's
Adam listening to Social Distortion and reading The Hobbit.
Well, this is even more punk than that, like Exploited or Dead Kennedy or something like that. Yeah. But this time, man, it was a bit of a... Maybe it was because we had a time
on top of his skateboard.
A bit of a chore. It was a bit of a chore, and I'm reading it knowing that I've got to remember, or I'm looking for juicy stuff to talk about, But while I'm reading it, I just want to enjoy the story. So, it's, I guess, kind of reading a book, kind of like a conquering army, as Jim Nestigan would say.
That's definitely this time around how I approached this. I got to say that this really stood out for me again. So if we were sitting in the Eagle and Child and having a debate like Lewis and Tolkien did about how to approach children's literature, I would be arguing Lewis's position, not Tolkien's. And this reminded me of that.
Yeah.
There's a strange, I would say, the pattern that I find myself in with Tolkien. And this can go into what Adam and I talked about with how he gets adopted by sort of pop culture and other... he reintroduces sort of this adventure fantasy genre. He's influencing every piece of fantasy in the pop culture that whether it's video games, TVs, movies, board games, Dungeons and Dragons. It really all gets renewed by Tolkien. And one of the reasons is he pumps an insane amount of detail in spaces where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. And it's not always, and this is maybe the difference between he and Lewis, it's not always details that are moving the story forward. In fact, most of the time where there's an excessive amount of detail, it's not an element that is pushing things forward. I never feel like this critique of Lewis that there isn't enough detail in his work is true. I just feel like the detail is used to advance the story more, whereas Tolkien is using it to sort of fill the room, fill the space. And I think that's where the source material aspect of Tolkien really comes in. Like if you're going to build a race of dwarves that becomes the lasting picture of dwarves for now almost 100 years, if The Hobbit is 1936, right? We're 13 years short of 100 years of influence of the picture of these various types of people and places and things in our minds, you have to have a lot of detail there. And he's obviously accomplished that. Although I think in the case of like what we tried to do, which was read the book in about a week, it can make it kind of difficult. The Hobbit was longer than I remember.
The pace of it difficult. I just compared to, and maybe it's because of the excess of detail, which I don't even think is the case in The Hobbit as much as it is in the other books. It's just, I don't know, it's kind of slow.
It's kind of slow.
Yeah.
A lot of walking.
So we can give the basic outline of it. So just, I think most people are familiar with it. But Bilbo is a hobbit. He lives in the Shire. Hobbits are...
In a hole. In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit.
But
right?
not the kind of hole that you imagine when you hear a hole in the ground.
Yeah. A well-furnished hole in the ground.
Yeah.
Lives a hobbit. And a hobbit is somewhere between a dwarf and a man.
It's a half man.
Is a half man, yeah, with furry feet and lacks a sense of adventure and really loves the well-furnished hole in the ground.
Although in Bilbo's family there has been some history of hobbits going on adventures.
Yeah.
Which is
on one side of the family.
On one side of the family.
And this little hobbit gets drafted into an adventure by Gandalf the Wizard, who... see, this is just where some of this detail comes in. Bilbo knows Gandalf. Gandalf's...
but doesn't recognize him when he first sees him.
But there's some sort of history there between Gandalf and the hobbits at this point in time. And Gandalf invites a party of dwarves to Bilbo's house, basically without his knowledge or consent.
They just sort of show up and pile in.
They show up and pile in
after another.
And Gandalf essentially puts a secret marker on his door. Has told these dwarves that Bilbo is a thief for hire.
Can we pause for a second? That secret mark, it's rune, right? It's a
rune, yeah.
Yeah, which is an Anglo-Saxon character. Which, this is, I guess I probably shouldn't have interjected because it's going to take us a little off, but one of the things in looking at the background or sort of the scholarly secondary sources on The Hobbit is just how much Anglo-Saxon mythology goes into The Hobbit, consciously and subconsciously. Like the word Hobbit itself, I guess, is a word that Tolkien just sort of came to Tolkien's mind, but you can find that word in Anglo-Saxon literature. And he had been reading some Anglo-Saxon literature, and I think maybe it just sort of was in his head, but he didn't really. The story is that he was grading essays at the end of one semester or a quarter, I guess it would have been, and he comes across like those blue books we had in college. Scott, you remember those? Mm-hmm. Rod used to have us write essays in these blue books. I don't know if they're blue books over there in England in the 1920s, but there's all these very ambitious Oxford students are filling up the booklet. And he comes across one where there's an empty page, I guess, at the end. And he's so thankful. He gives a student the equivalent of an A because they hadn't written so much. But on the last page, I guess he just kind of, I guess
That's
one
classic.
of our friends would call it a stream of consciousness. Just writes, in a hole there lived a hobbit. And that's sort of the thing that gets this moving. But there's a scholar at Gordon Cromwell Seminary, I think it's Dr. Ryan Reeve, who talks about how, or has written about how Tolkien in his day-to-day sort of research, reading all this Anglo-Saxon literature, there's all this stuff that is in his head and it comes out in The Hobbit. Sometimes it's purposeful, sometimes it's just part of Tolkien's, if you will, subconscious worldview. So you get these hobbits, and like Gandalf is... So there's an old Norse mythological text called the Elder Eddas that was discovered in the 1800s, I guess in some farmhouse somewhere. But it dates way back, and it has a list, all the dwarves that are listed. 13 dwarves? Mm-hmm. Those names appear in the Elder Eddas, and the last name there is Gandalfur. And so they don't. I can't remember whether Dr. Reeves says Tolkien purposely sort of lifted or not plagiarized, but borrowed, or if it just was subconscious. But all this stuff, all this detail is detail that Tolkien gains from other source material.
Yeah, I think that's why so he's the father of modern fantasy, but the reason it's so good and the reason is because you can still go back farther than Tolkien in many ways, right? Tolkien's not the inventor of elves. He repurposes the elf. He's not the inventor of dwarves. He repurposes the dwarf, right? He puts all these things together and creates a picture that melds and works together that ultimately gets used by just practically everybody, and in many ways sort of determines what the mind's eye sees when they see all these things. And it starts with just this little adventure in the Shire of a hobbit getting dragged around Middle Earth by dwarves.
Yeah, I mean, Lewis and Tolkien both do that, right? They draw heavily on Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon literature and sources to create types of characters. Dwarves. I thought it was funny when you're saying when you imagine a dwarf, you imagine it like a dwarf that Tolkien created, and I wonder how much of that is because of the movies.
Yep.
Well, Lewis has dwarves, of course, in the Chronicles of Narnia. They're a little less prominent, and they sort of are both good and evil.
Tolkien mentions that in this one as well, how most dwarves are not of the very good sort.
Right. And that, but I think, there weren't as many of those movies, and the dwarves didn't play as prominent a role in the stories or the movies, although in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the dwarf is kind of there right off the bat.
So I would say the movies definitely, when you picture stuff, but predating movies, things like classes of characters with certain attributes in, say, Dungeons and Dragons is, almost Tolkien. They're based off of Tolkien's.
Yeah, I believe that.
And
I just
elves.
think it's interesting, and it could just be the detail, right? He provides so much detail about their lives and their character and that type of thing that Lewis just doesn't really do that sort of.
He gives you full facial features.
Yeah, that dwarf just kind of shows up.
Yeah,
in service of the queen.
In service of the queen, and because he's short and angry, right? Yeah, that's kind of what you get. But so
sorry, I took off course, but
that's okay. The thing is because of this, we don't even have to sit and describe a dwarf very much, right? To say that Bilbo is greeted by 14 dwarves.
I will say one of the things that I was reminded of a little bit that I remember thinking when I first came across sort of. So in the movies, of course, the Lord of the Rings trilogy comes out first, and then The Hobbit comes out sometime later, which is kind of backwards of how the book's written, or not kind of is backwards. It's hard to sort of remember when you're watching those how Lewis describes things like the dwarves and the elves, and then comparing them to what you see in the movies. The elves are much more sort of like elvish in a kind of whimsical way in the books that they just aren't in the movies.
Only the serious tones have been taken.
Only the serious tones have been taken, which you do get from what is the woodland elves, more from sort of like. But even Elrond, as he's sort of characterized in the movies, is always serious, and in the books he's quite a bit more whimsical.
Playful,
as are the elves that they first meet on the road,
poking fun at dwarves and such. Yeah, they do. So that one's interesting as well. We can advance to there. I just want to move maybe a little bit, right? So
you want to get past chapter 1?
I just give the outline so that we can then hop around. I suppose is that Gandalf puts this rune on the door. 13 dwarves show up. They think they've been told Bilbo's a burglar who
of great repute.
Gandalf sort of tricked them as well. I think this is important. Gandalf sort of puts this little mess together between the Hobbit and the dwarves, both sides not really knowing what they're getting into or who they're going with. And they leave the Shire. They run into trolls pretty quickly.
And Bilbo shows himself to be a fairly poor burglar.
Shows himself to be a very poor burglar. Yes. Sort of alarms the trolls, gets captured. The dwarves try to save the day. That doesn't go very well. Ultimately, Gandalf has to
expose him to sunlight.
Yeah, he distracts. He ends up sort of distracting and confusing the trolls until they leave themselves exposed to the sunlight. Trolls exposed to sunlight become stone in Tolkien's world, and they're
as
set
they
free.
Should in every world.
Yeah, and they're set free. They come across some treasure and in some important things, including some weapons, elvish weapons,
ancient elvish weapons
that were used to kill orcs and goblins. And journey moves on. They end up in with Elven City, but they end up with the elves, with Elrond.
Well, they first get in this battle with the goblins, right?
Oh, yeah. Is it goblins then elves? Or is it elves and goblins? Oh, no.
It's
been a week.
Goblins.
It's elves and goblins.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, then they end up with the elves.
I was skinning up a very steep hill when I was listening to this.
They end up with the elves. Elrond is there. Now, Elrond, this is where, Tolkien, I think from context we know, is not planning further books as this is being written. Like, The Lord of the Rings isn't being imagined yet, nor is any of the extended lore. And Elrond becomes one of the most sort of revisited characters in all of Tolkien's work. He's prominent or plays a pivotal role in all of the works. He's part of the extended lore as well in the sort of the Lost Tales and Silmarillion and stuff, and is the focus of the current expansion of this. Now that Tolkien didn't write, but the current expansion of the Lord of the Rings universe with Rings of Power as well. Very central. So from this one elf that he starts in this one-off, what is intended originally to be one-off adventure story, spans like a character in a universe and elves around him.
Well, he's very old.
He's very old. So Elrond gives them some ponies. He enlightens them on some secret information hidden on a map that comes in useful
later.
You
can only see by moonlight of a particular moon.
At a particular part of the year.
At a particular part of the year. That would be very annoying.
That would be. I love that they're in Elrond's house on the night of the year that
you can see it.
That you can read the map.
Yeah. Convenient.
He gives them supplies and some ponies. Ponies are a recurring theme. Tolkien must have really liked the ponies, because they're these guys get ponies 4 times in this book, and then ponies are prevalent in Lord of the Rings also.
Well, he hated cars, so
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
And
so you give them ponies
because they're all short.
Yeah, they're all short. Yeah. So they get some ponies. A bunch of stuff happens. They end up inside a mountain full of goblins. They get ran out of them. Now, actually,
the goblins are originally not as ticked off as you would think when capturing them until they see these elvish blades that are pretty much intended to kill goblins.
Yeah, yeah.
And then they get real upset that they're there.
And killed all their
understandably
forefathers.
So.
During some hustle and bustle with the goblins, Bilbo falls down a cave inside the mountain.
He meets another very recurring character.
And he meets another very recurring character, Gollum.
My precious.
Yeah, you whisper. and Gollum wants to eat Bilbo. I think that's sort of the notable thing. He's this cave creature that is eating things that fall down from up above. So basically, goblins that fall down the hole, maybe scraps of food, bones. They get taught trash. Right? So you get this very a very dangerous creature, you would think, at the bottom. I mean, a very desperate.
Teach you not to go down watery holes. Maybe there's a life lesson in there that Tolkien's trying to tell his kids.
And don't fall down. Don't go exploring in caves where you can't see things.
Mm-hmm. He mentions that earlier on, that that's what makes caves such dangerous things. You can't often see how large they are. Or what's at the back of them.
Yeah. And Gollum is in possession of a ring of power, one might say.
You don't know this, though.
You do not know this yet. But he's in possession of a ring that Bilbo finally ups his game as a burglar.
Yeah. Well, he actually becomes a burglar because of the ring.
Yeah. And and steals the ring essentially from Gollum as well. Finds it lost initially. Gollum has been searching for it. He lost it. And Bilbo keeps it. Kind of knows that this is what Gollum is looking for. The precious.
You get
as you were whispering at him.
The riddle scene.
And they have a riddle off.
A riddle off, yeah.
Now there's
Bilbo wins, but full on cheating. It's not a riddle.
No, he cheats.
Yeah.
He wins by
what's
cheating.
In my pocket?
Yeah.
How the hell am I supposed to know?
Yeah,
what's in your pocket?
That's not a riddle. Now I'm curious. We all probably have newer versions of the book, but this riddle game ends two different ways. So this is sort of. I was wondering why. I have a quote critical edition. I didn't even know one could have such. I didn't even know that it was just what was on my library on my bookshelf. I don't even know where I got it, but I was reading through some of the differences, and Tolkien changes the ending of the riddle scene after the Lord of the Rings is written to make
it fit
more sense.
Yeah. In 1953, 37,
something like that.
Oh, 53. Yeah.
Yeah, look at Adam. Wow.
Boom.
Yeah, he edits it. So at the end of I think the version we probably all read, Gollum sort of freaks out after he loses the riddle game and is sort of threatening to, eat Bilbo and take the ring back anyways, because after the little what's in my pocket, he kind of figures out that Bilbo's taken something from him. Mm-hmm. And he edited in this scene of the aggravated Gollum, which apparently was originally just Gollum saying, "Congratulations, you've won the riddle game. Have a nice day."
Let me take you to the exit.
Yeah, I'll show you the way out.
I will be an honorable evil person.
Yes. Yeah, so he goes from being an honorable cave dwelling creature to a ferocious one because of the gravity of what he's apparently lost. Is the change here. So if you read this today, you'll get a very angry Gollum. And, they escape the cave with much trouble and the assistance of the ring, which Bilbo finds out inside the cave that if he puts it on, makes him invisible. And they get chased by some goblins outside of the cave down a mountain, which ends up with an extended scene of them trapped in trees for a very long time. For an excessive amount of time, actually. You notice how long they're just up in trees throwing pine cones at goblins? Gandalf's back at the end of the cave and is also trapped up. That's the other thing. You have these little men, and then you have this 6.5 foot tall wizard stuck up in a tree lighting. And Gandalf is he's described in this book as sort of being a wizard of fire and light. All right. And so he's lighting pine cones on fire and tossing them on goblins and lighting goblins on fire with explosive pine cones.
It's pretty rad.
It's actually pretty fun. He's whispering into pine cones, lighting them on fire and tossing them into goblins. They're rescued by eagles, which is a reoccurring theme.
Right.
In this, Lord of the Eagles saves them. They're said the eagles save them not because they like dwarves or hobbits, but because they really don't like goblins. The eagles also really don't like goblins.
I mean, who does?
Yeah, who does like goblins? They get saved. Eagles, they go back on their adventure. They end up in the house of a bear man, Bjorn, He's a man by day. Yeah, from Beowulf. He's a man by day, bear by night. They spend some time there, a long time at Bjorn's place relative to the length of the story. Set off again on an adventure. Run into some spiders, also a recurring thing. Some giant spiders. Bilbo really coming into his own, reveals that at the time the spiders reveals he has the ring to the dwarves, and that it makes him invisible, and that he's saved their butts a couple times via invisibility. And then also this sets up sort of a backdrop for later that Bilbo does a lot of damage to the spiders with this elvish sword that he got at the trolls named Sting. And later, Frodo has that sword on the adventure in the Lord of the Rings, and the spiders remember the sword, much like the goblins remember the sword from when elves were killing goblins. So there's definitely some like thing with long memory here as well that goes on, and generational memory that is set up. They go to a long lake. They meet men who make barrels and tubs and and stuff like that.
Well, for exchanging good with the woodland elves, right?
Yeah, right.
That's
they have a relationship with the elves.
That's like their barge cargo system.
Yeah, yeah. So they make
barrels.
Yeah, they make barrels and spend some time there, and then they end up at the Lonely Mountain. And Bilbo, they find this secret door that the map that Elrond read in the moon. They end up waiting. It's funny. So for all this detail that he packs in, like in 2 sentences, he passes like 10 days in front of this door, as they're just sitting in front of this door, not knowing how to open it. Eventually, the door sort of opens by the key that Thorin has, and being the right time with the moon shining on it. We got this whole moon connection again, which is funny. It's almost like, as I was reading, it was almost like Tolkien remembered suddenly that he added this moon part, because it happens very quick. It's like, we can't remember to open the door. Oh crap, the moon is on the door. Open it quickly. Then Bilbo sneaks in, and there's a dragon on the treasure. Steals some treasure, awakens the dragon Smog, and then that's basically, I mean, we're getting towards the end here, so we could probably now fill in. I don't know what you guys want to do, but a couple things stand out to me. The long such generational memory thing is a very notable sort of aspect of his storytelling to me. We see this with these elvish swords. We see it later in the Lord of the Rings. We see it with the spiders. We see there's definitely, and the dwarves, the whole mission of the dwarves has to do with generational memory as well.
Well, he does that too later on when he kind of, doesn't he take like he does a pause on telling the story of the adventures and goes back to tell the story of when Smaug first came into Lake Town.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he kind of always sets up the history. I like that part of it.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we should try to find ways, and Adam and I already said this was going to be difficult, but if we're trying to find ways in where sort of Christian influence or Tolkien's Catholicity comes into the worldview that produces these stories, I feel like the handing down of
tradition,
of story from generation to generation by telling the story is a significant part of this.
Here's part of my struggle with the analysis of this, is that I can see this as a good, fun story that you might tell your kids if you were a more imaginative person than I am, which is seemingly what he did. I'm just too dense to see sort of the deeper meaning in this. I don't know how it escapes me, and everybody else sees it, but it escapes me. It's a cool adventure, but I don't see if there are sort of Catholic or Christian themes in it, I have you can see them, but you only can see them in terms of morality.
There is that, and he stops to point out some moral failings. So, like at the meeting of Smaug, he's described, and it literally stops, which is in a almost fourth wall breaking way, and Tolkien goes, and Smaug is angry and jealous in the way that a rich man who has everything in the world is angry when he realizes one of the things he forgot that he even owned is missing, and he gets irrationally angry.
Happens to me all the time. Like I saw your brother wearing a watch of mine that I forgot I owned, that apparently he stole.
And so he stops the story to sort of give a very plain moral explanation of excess riches, right, and the problems that come along with it. So you get that occasionally, where Tolkien stops the story to teach the moral lesson.
I get that, but it's harder to see like actual sort of like creedal Christian themes in it beyond like sin and failing.
Oh, I completely agree. I don't see creedal Christianity here. I wouldn't say I don't see things that
not
are
even
thematically.
Like you don't even. I'm not even talking about like obviously. I don't even see them thematically. Like you don't see like a lot of sacrifice for others or that type of thing. I don't know. What do you think, Adam? I'm dense with this stuff.
I completely agree with you that it's. I mean the Christian theology, if you will, or theological background to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings is very clandestine. It's you really have to squeeze it out. Caleb, you and I talked about how there's a reason why there's so many different interpretations of Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, because he's not overtly doing a kind of apologetic for the tender-hearted or any, as Lewis might describe it. I think if there is one Christian doctrine or major component of the Christian worldview that looms large in Hobbit and Lord of the Rings is the doctrine of the fall.
Yeah, that's why I said sin and failing.
Yeah, absolutely everything. But another thing that I don't know, one of the problems in reading this again and knowing a bit more about Tolkien is I'm trying to figure out, like, should I read this to try to understand Tolkien's mind? Or should I just read this? I mean,
to enjoy it.
To enjoy it, should I read it as if it's got some sort of didactic purpose? And I don't know. But one thing that something I read somewhere along the line made this distinction or pointed this out, that early on in that first chapter, Bilbo's sitting there on his stoop, I guess, reading the mail.
Yeah,
and there's some sort of like train whistle too. I can't remember where it was. There's like these kind of modernish references.
Yeah,
like anachronisms.
Yeah, gunpowder is referenced in there, and I'm like,
yeah. And
so he says it smelled like gunpowder. I'm like, how the heck would they have known what gunpowder smelled like?
Yeah. And so you got like, it's almost like the hobbits or Bilbo they're kind of allegorical to modern people, and then all of a sudden these people from who harken back to this kind of golden age appear. And then Bilbo is pulled into that epic quest to recover something from ancient days. And this is just a description. I guess I don't really care so much if I offend Catholic listeners, but traditional Catholics do have this nostalgia for the past and tradition. And especially, they have a kind of this view that in the past, in the Middle Ages, there was this Catholic golden age. And it's almost like this story is kind of an allegory for that in an odd sort of way. I don't know. I mean, I don't have.
Yeah, that's interesting. I kind of see that. I've never even thought about that. But
I am not didn't we do this? Was it this summer? I am not a literary theorist or whatever the right terminology.
You're doing better than me so far.
It's really hard to put this in like the correct terms, I guess. But there is something it just feels very traditional Catholic. Not the particulars, just the feeling of it, if you will.
Well, I think there's, like, if I was going to pick a theology that is here, there is something about driving oneself forward towards, like, self making better and good, and it starts off with, and the thing that I think makes it Roman Catholic.
Bilbo goes on the adventure.
Yeah, and the thing that makes it Catholic to me, and why Protestants are probably not going to pick up on this theological theme, or at least Lutherans, is that the adventure starts off assisted. It starts off with Gandalf pushing you into the adventure. It starts off with him intervening more, saving your skins more, like when it comes to trolls, getting you to the elves, the eagles, saving you from goblins. And as the story progresses, Gandalf intervenes less and less. And in fact, there's a moment at Bjorn's, and Bilbo takes over. And especially once we get to Smaug in the last couple of chapters here, and they get to the mountain, Bilbo, it even stops and says, like, Bilbo would never have done this, but now he's become the type of person who would, encourage the dwarves forward, and is going to enter the mountain, is going to talk to Smaug. Like, he's now the type of hobbit that will face the dragon, right?
The alpha male, right?
he develops from a character who hides away in a hole, to the person who will drive along the story. And what I see is sort of, this Christian life, maybe sanctification sort of theology, where at first you need a lot of help. You need God's help. You need a priest or a prophet or somebody to intervene and push you along your way. But eventually your will, your desires will have been cultivated along the journey, such that out of yourself you will produce the right motivation and the right actions to continue the story along.
Yes, and somewhere in my, I'm using air quotes here for our listeners, in my research, it's not really research, it's just me poking around, I read that Tolkien often said that he is Bilbo Baggins. And it's like, this is, and again, this is just a description, and there really is something admirable about it. I think it's theologically wonky, but this Bilbo is not really a man of virtue at first. When we first meet him, he's just content living his life as it is. Then these dwarves sing the story about their homeland and so on. He gets caught up into their story, going back, and in the process of going back to this bigger reality, or at least a bigger, in a historical sense, reality, Bilbo matures. He progresses in virtue and becomes, he's evolving into a better, more virtuous man. And I think that's not just a Catholic thing. That's a very normal thing for people who have a sort of that opinion of the law, that if you just do what is right and work harder, you'll be fine. But I think that's the thing that's I think behind the theological narrative behind this whole story. Now, whether Tolkien's doing that consciously or not, I wouldn't have any idea. Your dad?
Yeah, I
have no idea.
I
do think it's interesting, though, that you're kind of one of the, I think, criticisms that I'll even just say somebody that's sort of steeped in a reformational theology might levy against Roman Catholic theology in general, is that it kind of fits a little bit too neatly into the general view of the rest of the world and all other religions. In other words, when you say that that's not necessarily a Catholic theology, that's just sort of a normal, sort of world view of things. Yeah, that's true. But what makes Christianity, or at least I think what the text tells us, makes sort of Christ uniquely God, is that he breaks that mold, and that then salvation doesn't come through your own personal betterment or your own mastery of the law anymore. It comes solely through him, which is just a theme that it might have been way too clear for Tolkien and Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, but it's just a theme in the Chronicles of Narnia that just is there. Aslan is the savior of Narnia and needs to be known by his name in our world, which is Christ. And there's just something really beautiful to that I'm not saying this completely lacks, but it's just, if it's there, it's hidden here in a way that I think you have to probably read these stories more than twice to see.
I think every children's, as I was getting to the end of the book and sort of watching this progression of, I think specifically not just Bilbo's actions, but desires being different because of the adventure along the way. I was thinking to myself, this is great, but this is the moral story of every children's Disney and DreamWorks movie that I watch with my children.
Well,
every single one.
Specifically within sort of, you might call it medieval theology. This is the development of the habitus, right? That's you don't even know is happening to you sometimes, but you just sort of you go through the practices of the liturgy and the Christian life and the sacraments, and eventually that habit or that habitus or that sort of intentional sort of making of your will to fit more with God's desire for your life that just eventually happens, and you become this Catholic person or this medieval sort of Christian person. And you can definitely, I think you can see some of that there. And that is definitely focused on a changing of your will. Your will goes from one that is centered on you to one that is centered in their case on sort of the church and the sacraments.
Now, I want to be clear. I think there's certainly a tension here because the complaint with this is sort of what Adam was pointing out, that this is a normal sort of view of the law, and so the tension is that this is really good advice for your day-to-day life, like pursuing things, having habits, changing something about you changing, or your desires changing, so that something that was hard to do in the past is something that you'll actively pursue.
This is advice that even at the beginning, the going on the adventure is advice that not only would you give, but that I do give. I mean, just last week, when your brother was headed up to Nevada, we said, hey man, you should take the extra step and stop over at Mammoth for a couple hours on your way down. It's going to be harder, but it's, you should say yes to these type of adventures when they present themselves to you. And, he did, and it was great, and we were all happy for him. And that's sort of, but that's temporal.
The distinction I would make is it is not the advice or the means of your Christian life, or other way people say your Christian walk. In fact, it's
Josh going up to Mammoth didn't make him more pleasing to God.
Yeah, right. And so, so this is sort of like the
made
advice
him more pleasing to his earthly father.
This is how the old Adam can sort of live and thrive in this world, but it's not how you'll reach God. And that's sort of the distinction, right? Is that God can't be had by going on the adventures.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying Tolkien. Well, he's Catholic, so we can assume. But I'm not saying that's what this works. It doesn't. The Hobbit obviously doesn't say, "And now go pursue God like Bilbo pursued the treasure under the lonely mountain." Right. It's not a parable in that sense.
Which is what Tolkien must have thought Lewis was doing in The Lion, the Witch, and the Ward.
Right. And Tolkien, has...
Now go seek Aslan, like Peter sought Aslan in my tale.
So I don't want to, say that that's what he's saying, but I just want to say that the sort of the moral lesson of The Hobbit ought not be transported to your theological approach to how to pursue God. In a different way than how sort of the Chronicles of Narnia possesses a lesson that is not just moral, and sort of finds a way to describe how God pursues you and atones for you. So it's a different beast. It definitely, as I was reading it, and maybe listeners will be able to tell, we'll see, makes it challenging for a show like the Thinking Fellows to approach, which helps answer the question, we've been asked a bunch of times, why haven't you guys done The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings? This is part of it. It's harder for us to stay in our lane commenting on this.
We should have Sam on the show. He'd be a great help to us on this.
I think I know we're way past time, but
that's fine.
If you compare like the disposition of Lewis and the disposition of Tolkien, not that we really know, but just from the sense you can get from reading their stuff and what others say about them, it's like Tolkien really mourns the loss of Christendom. And Lewis probably would have preferred to live in Christendom, but there's no going back for Lewis.
Well,
he figures out how to be comfortable in the world he's living in. Whereas
Lewis
Tolkien
spent a lot of time, of a good portion of his life, sort of celebrating the loss of Christendom, though. Whereas Tolkien never did.
No,
that's a
so as
thesis
a I mean, one of the things you sometimes get with converts to the faith is they become more ardent than people who have lived in it, right, their whole lives.
Yeah,
but
interesting.
I would say that that Lewis became very ardent in the faith, but he didn't necessarily ever become very ardent culturally Christian.
No, that's true.
Yeah,
we commented on that last time as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Whereas Lewis or Tolkien, he was always not just Roman Catholic, but always very ardently culturally Catholic as well.
Yeah. And it's almost like Lewis is trying to be a guide for how to navigate the world that he was living in as a Christian, whereas Tolkien's, I don't know if he was grumpy or not. He was an introvert, right? But he was probably a little grumpy about the world he lived in.
Well,
and he thought there
don't
was
you think Lewis's experience gives all of his writings a very apologetic character, or at least all of his sort of writings that aren't in his sort of professional field. All of his Christian's writings have a very apologetic. Even his autobiography is the story of how he came to the faith. So that if you're kicking it around, you might look at his story and come to the faith, right? Tolkien's Christianity is more assumed. And you can sometimes, if you have conversations, I have these conversations all the time because I live kind of in two Lutheran worlds. I live in the Lutheran world of Rod Rosenblatt and John Warwick Montgomery, which is always centered on Christian apologetics to the non-believer, and then live in the world of sort of, I might call it sort of the gymnastic and Steve Paulson sort of thing too, where that's rarely the thing that's foremost on the mind, because they sort of grew up in a world where they were defending Lutheranism to Lutherans. They very much, their apologetic is, what did Luther actually teach regarding the will and salvation? And so their Christianity, in my opinion, Paulson's and Nestigan's, is always assumed, right? And it's rarely, this may not be a good characteristic, but it's rarely sort of focused out on the world of those who don't yet believe. It seems like it's always sort of catechetical and helping those within the world of believers, which is very much, it seems like if this is a Christian/Catholic work at all, this is what that is, this and the Lord of the Rings, whereas Lewis is always focused out on the people that were like him, lost in a world of materialism, and how can I help them overcome that?
It's probably,
so I don't think Lewis is very much, I think, intentionally not mourning the loss of Christendom or trying to convince people to become Christian for the sake of a new Christendom.
Culture. Yep.
Yeah.
I think you're right. And commentators say that if there's one, if you're going to really understand C.S. Lewis, you have to understand that he believes every human being has an eternal soul, and he's deeply concerned about that.
I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, to me, this has partly to do with like the story is the storyteller in a sense. Like, what is that your experience really does determine what kind of good work, and not in the theological sense, but you can produce, right? Like, Tolkien is not a convert. His production of a sort of apologetic would be probably one that is just logical and makes sense to him, and he thinks people should do. And when you use like the Rod and Montgomery stuff too, both of them have not Lewis's story, but stories of
Similar.
of doubt or leaving the faith or coming to the faith from or scientism or materialism reigning for a period of time.
Montgomery's story is actually very sort of life story is Lewisian in a sense. I mean, it's very, very similar.
And then you can
a little less poetic.
You can go to Nefskin and Paulson and see that they're raised Lutherans who see the death of sort of Lutheranism in Lutheran churches.
And in the Midwest.
Yeah.
See the death of cultural Lutheranism in the Midwest. I mean, this is Jim's sort of handing over the goods lecture is very much a story of, or what he calls secondary confirmation is very much sort of the loss of sort of not just the Lutheran worldview, but the Lutheran world.
Right. In
sort of the rural and even metropolis sort of Midwest, the St. Paulish area. And you get, Nestkin's best line is that he's got a lot of good lines. I memorized a catechism to the rhythm of my grandfather's John Deere tractor. That's like...
Yeah, that...
Okay. There's no longer kids sitting on their grandpa's John Deere tractor as it's sort of like hit and miss going through the fields and grandpa's reciting the catechism to them. That's just not happening, and he mourns that, and he should mourn that. That's a wonderful thing, right? And you kind of, if that's what sort of Tolkien's doing here, it's very understandable to try to sort of, hey, and I really like, Adam, you said it a while ago, I really like it actually might help me as we read further. The picture of sort of Bilbo himself and the hobbits as sort of like the modern to Tolkien in the 1920s, modern Englishmen, right?
Yeah.
It's definitely interesting, and so I think with that perspective, I would say I'm not looking for Tolkien to be Lewis. He had a different life. It just means that these stories are harder to theologically analyze.
Yeah,
absolutely.
It's fine.
That's good stuff.
Which
stretches our brains.
On to the Fellowship of the Ring.
Yeah.
A much shorter tale.
Okay,
wait a minute.
Much shorter tale. I was going to say this for listeners who have made it all the way to our longer episode here. Longer books require longer episodes. We are probably going to have to space. This is 20 hours of reading. I don't think any of us can sacrifice 20 hours in 1 week to finishing the Fellowship of the Ring.
Depends on how much splitboard snowboarding.
Yeah,
skinny.
20, probably not 20 hours.
Probably not 20
of it. So we will probably what we're going to do is we'll have a Christmas episode next week. It'll be Christmas week. The episode will be out, 5 days before Christmas, but we'll have a Christmas episode, and then we'll go to the Fellowship of the Ring. So
then we'll have a New Year's episode to give us a week break.
Then we're going to have a New Year's episode, and then I don't know how we're going to.
Then we'll have an Epiphany episode.
So we'll see what happens. But I'm going to give us at least 2 weeks to Fellowship of the Ring, since 20 hours is a lot of reading. And if
man, I'm going to be a good snowboarder by the end of this series.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. He's listening to the Audible while snowboarding.
And I'm skinning up the hill.
So
what's skinning up the hill mean?
It means like cross-country skiing from the bottom
that's
to
why
the
you're
top.
all jacked and ripped and handsome.
Oh my
It's that I'm shredding my core every night.
Yeah. So, well, thank you, listeners, for joining us for this. It's been long requested for us to read the fictional works of Tolkien, so hopefully you enjoyed our thoughts on The Hobbit and maybe even our struggle to figure out how to approach this. We will be back next week with a Christmas episode, and then we will do the Fellowship of the Ring. All right, thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time. Bye.